that makes these these countries on the continent actually go up, and consistently you've seen that they've been topping. And actually the one who won the 2015 prize, the president, the head of state that won the prize this year is from Namibia. And so what is it that has given these countries this kind of ranking? But before even then, let me just give you an idea of some of the things that they've been looking at in these rankings. First of all, safety and rule of law, and then participation and human rights, sustainable economic opportunity, and then human development. Those 4 indicators, they have a lot of things under them, but basically safety and rule of law, participation and human rights, sustainable economic opportunity, and human development. And then the bottom 5 countries you heard earlier. So we have them there as well. They are, let me just get that quickly, Eritrea, South Sudan, Central African Republic, so Sudan was there before South Sudan. And then we have Somalia as well. And we've been reporting a lot about conflict from these countries. So generally, let's start with you, Otis.
A warm good evening to our viewers out there. First and foremost, I think the Mo Ibrahim measure of governance is about the largest measure of governance in Africa. Yeah. Because I'm quite aware the Afrobarometer doesn't cover all African countries, and the Mo Ibrahim Index covers almost all the 54 African countries. So it makes it the largest measure of governance or the progress of governance on the continent. Yet still, I think that it is not a foolproof measure of governance to start with, as much as the Mo Ibrahim, the indices that are used to measure governance are supposed to perhaps measure the quality and help us to improve on it. Governance is not a project. Governance is a process, and you don't measure a process because a process involves instances of success and failure, and it involves constant trial to make sure that you better the process. But having said that,
it's been monitoring it annually on an annual basis.
Exactly, and that's what I'm saying, that when you monitor something on an annual basis as a project, with set indices, it means that you are expecting it to grow. But governance is not a project, it's a process. It's like human relations. We may be laughing today, tomorrow we might not be laughing. It doesn't mean that it might diminish the level of friendship between us. For all you know, it is just it's just a pedal to launch it to a further level. What I'm trying to say basically is that governance shouldn't be measured by a set of indices, and then by that set of indices we assume that things are working or not working. But then I must admit that it provides some very basic basis upon which we can at least see whether what we are doing in terms of the governance that we have given unto ourselves, as to which direction we are heading towards. And that launches me into the question you asked. It's good. If you look at the first five countries, for instance, Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, in the last couple of years have featured constantly in the first 5. The only 2 countries or 3 countries that have perhaps dropped are Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia. They have dropped, and it's all because of the Arab Spring and the consequences of the colonial or neo-colonial powers activities in the Maghreb region. But that not to speak, you also see that the bottom 5 countries have been perpetual.
They've been recurring.
And that tells you how volatile the Horn of Africa and the Central African region has been. If you look at the 5 countries, 4 out of the 5 are in the Horn of Africa, i.e. Sudan, Eritrea, South Sudan, and Somalia. And then Central African Republic in the last 2 years in the last 20 years, for instance, they have not had a stable government, and they've had coups upon coups in the past 2 decades. So it tells you how volatile that region is, and you can trace that region right from, and I'm sure if you look at the index very well, countries like Niger, Mauritius, they've not fared very well. Countries like Chad, they've not fared very well. And if you look at the conflict fault line in Africa, it runs right from Chad through the Sahara Desert, through Nigeria, northern Nigeria, Cameroon, enters into Central African Republic. On the right, then you have South Sudan, Eritrea, and Somalia in the Horn of Africa. So it gives you the picture about the measure of security, stability, safety, rule of law in those regions. And we know that in every country where there are incidents of war, violent conflict, all these ingredients are missing. However, if you look at the stable countries, and so the stable countries basically mean all those countries that are not seeing any form of violent conflict, except perhaps for Cote d'Ivoire and Mali, you realize that they've also made significant strides, even though some of them have also retrogressed. And that is to say that it's all adds to the quality or to the progress that is being made on the governance level in Africa. As I said earlier on, governance is not a project, it is a process. And in that process, there are fault lines, there are stumbling blocks. You will stumble, you will falter at a point. But this helps you to see where you faltered, how you can go about that fault line, how you can amend it, and how you can go forward and improve upon it. And so, yes, as much as I think that the Mo Ibrahim Index is not a foolproof measure, it is not subject to it is not immune from criticism. As much as I believe that it only has a minimalist approach to measuring governance in Africa, I still think that at least it has made that effort, and that we should just try and see how we can improve upon it.
Yeah. Great. Patrick, your comments on the first 5 and last 5.
Well, first 5 and last 5, Conrad, you can only appreciate them if you understand the construct of the index itself. I mean, I agree with Kafui, but to a point. The objective of the index, as it were, I mean, based on governance, and clearly Mo Ibrahim defines what governance should be, the index. As it were, the ability of a state to deliver the public goods and services in terms of political goods, economic and social goods, that the citizens have a right to demand, and the state is enjoined to provide. So you have a two-way affair there. Now, if you look at the first 5 countries that we have listed, I mean, you've seen Mauritius there, it has consistently been there. You probably see Namibia playing in that region as well. The point is that these countries consistently, if you look at this specific objective that has been defined by governance, I mean, governance is a very soft phenomenon that, like he rightly says, you can't quantify. I mean, it's a process that you have. But for us to appreciate whether or not we are seeing improvements and movements, whether the movements are pro or against, we would have to put certain quantities on them, right? And I am sure that is the attempt that's been made by Mo Ibrahim. I mean, I wouldn't equally say that is the most robust measure, but we don't have any measure for governance as well on the continent. And so, to that extent, and the fact that they've even published a methodology by which the indices are arrived at, I think it is something we can bank our hopes on to measure whether the countries are doing well in provision of social, political, and economic goods that the citizens have a right to demand, and the state is enjoined to provide them. Now, they take a certain timeline as far as this year's report is concerned. 2011. Oh, we were the star of Africa in 2011, weren't we? As a country, Ghana, we were the eye-opening country to Africa. But look at what we have seen from 2011 till today, And so if you put all of these things together, clearly, it might not necessarily be representative of virtually every single development that might be happening on the governance front. But at least the countries that have been identified and the comments that you have seen and the scores that the countries have had, I don't think is far off from the measurement and what we would ordinarily expect to see. I mean, I'm seeing Somalia consistently in the bottom, Sudan, South Sudan. These are countries that naturally have been plagued by all kinds of political instabilities, and he's right when he mentions them. I mean, that's a fact. Now, anytime you've seen these political rifts, the ability of the citizens to, as it were, demand these public goods and political, social, and economic public goods, they've not been able to do that. And so clearly these countries should be lagging behind. Does this give us a cause for worry? I think it only tells us, it gives us a certain snapshot about the state of affairs of a country as far as the social contract between the governments that we have and the governed look like.
Okay.
So we can improve. I'm sure that's what the index, there's no index that gives you a certain absolute measurement of a certain state of affair, particularly when it comes to the social sciences, where the behavior of humans is extremely difficult for you to measure. But it tells us where our weaknesses are and where our strengths are.
Okay.
First of all, as a continent, and Mo Ibrahim is equally quick to admit that Africa is
not
diverse. We are not a country that different contexts, different scenarios, different situations. And it will make sense, therefore, to understand these diversities, and then we try as much as possible to tweak solutions that we want to improve governance. We tweak the solutions based on these country contexts. You've seen lots of, our 21 countries are countries that slacked as far as the index was concerned. Okay, and these are countries that hitherto, if you look back from the 90s, were countries that were doing well, they were pushing the barrier. Okay, every single country you have in Africa has, post-colonialism has had its own, post-independence has had its own political and civil strifes. But consistently, we expect a certain movement towards participatory democracy where people can not only elect leaders, but they take part in the governance affairs of the country. When you go to a place like Rwanda, people might have the public goods being delivered, but is it open for people to participate? Can the people challenge the governance systems? You have rule of law, for example, working. When you begin to put all of these issues together, then you get a certain sense of the direction that, first of all, individual countries should be following, or where they should be going to, and where the African continent itself should be looking. The kind of aspirations we should have as far as roping the 1.2 billion people we have on the continent collectively into the governance systems to ensure that we deliver the public goods in economics, social, and then the political life. Otherwise, we are going to be faced with lots of challenges that we might not be able to deal with. If it takes South Sudan, these are debates we've had every now and then. There's a lot of political instability that you can reduce to leadership. If you take Sudan, virtually same challenges. You can have all kinds of inferences being drawn from which powers are involved, who's involved, and whether or not these vested interests and vestiges that you have can resolve the quagmire. But at least for me, what is exciting about the index is that it points to a certain relationship that should exist between the governed and the state, and whether or not the organization of state machinery for the delivery of public goods and services are functioning well. It is not an absolute measure of every development that we have in the country. That should be said. But at least it tells us where the weaknesses are and how these weaknesses can be strengthened. I've seen some an analysis and reports that have tried to quantify, for example, the scores that the countries have had. All the countries you've seen, the scores you've had as against the total productivity of the economy. And truth be told, some of the countries you are seeing that are scoring high, for example, don't have a fair distribution of wealth. So you might see a country that scores high. That's the first correlation. A country that scores high on the index, necessarily you might find a certain level of growth. So some of them are scoring, they're having average growth rates over the past 5 years of 7.6% per annum. That makes sense. But then we have to move the debate further, because if everybody is to benefit from that growth, which is as a result of the stable governance or the improvement, the minimal improvement in governance, then we might have to tweak the debate a little bit to see the extent to which the system for governance itself ensures a certain trickle-down effect of that growth, economic growth or economic development that you might have seen. And I think that's where we begin to lose it, because these countries have governance systems, all right, that are improving. You find a certain growth and development that is associated with it, but the growth doesn't trickle down. So you find that happening, but then still the inequality gap, for instance, is widened. And so how do we balance that debate? I think the index gives us this opportunity to interrogate these other variables to see where we can strengthen our systems and structures to improve development within the African continent.
Interesting thoughts there, Patrick. And so it says, looking at the continent as a whole, according to the report, Mr. Ibrahim actually indicated that he had some concerns about the pace at which things are changing. And he said that while launching the index, he was saying that Africans are healthier and they live in more democratic societies compared to 15 years ago. But recent progress in other key areas on the continent has either stalled or reversed. And he added that this was a sign, a warning sign for us all. And actually, some countries that stood out, Zimbabwe, was listed as the 44th country, and he said it has shown big improvements over the last 4 years, but nonetheless, was ranked 44th out of the 54 countries. Then ordinary Zimbabweans, when they were actually interviewed, they said they were surprised to hear that things were actually improving because, they were so surprised that the things, that had been said in the report were actually so, because they thought that everything had remained the same or they had just actually retrogressed. And then also Nigeria. Nigeria came 39th, and even that was also even an increase over the previous year's report. Ethiopia came 31st, and then Ghana was ranked 7th, and it actually dropped from the 6th that was ranked, it was ranked in 2014. Now, so looking at these country specifics, and then in the general context of the fact that, well, there are some improvements here and there, but generally they say things are deteriorating. I mean, the progress is stalling.
Thank you, Conrad. Baiti, that's why from the onset, I have said that, and rightly so, as Patrick said, that there is diversity on the continent. Africa is perhaps the most diverse continent in the world. It makes it difficult to apply universalistic measure.
That's a big word.
To basically, what I'm trying to say, it makes it difficult to apply a linear scale to countries to country specific occurrences.
Okay.
What do I mean? Now, as you said in Zimbabwe, the ordinary Zimbabwe that was interviewed made those assertions. For all you know, it depends on where that person was interviewed. Take Nigeria, for example. Nigeria is being hailed currently as, it's currently the new kid on the block when it comes to electoral democracy. Why? Because everybody feared that Nigeria wasn't going to cross that Rubicon after May 7th election or so, May 29th election. But then they did it. And we are now hailing Nigeria as a stable country that have been able, amidst all its challenges of Boko Haram and suicide bombing, that has been able to peacefully hand over power, political power, from one head of state to another head of state. But what are we seeing? We are seeing a retrogression. If Mo Ibrahim is admitting... No,
actually, there was an improvement.
But generally, it's still in the 30s, and you wonder why Nigeria should be in the 30s. Yes, Nigeria has faced some turbulent times in the past few years with the Boko Haram insurgency. But the question is that, are we looking at the root causes of these conflicts? Are we looking at them? I want to, those who have what it takes to liberate the continent are just paying lip service to us. And one of them, unfortunately, I must admit, is Mo Ibrahim himself. Now, if you are telling me that generally things have improved, but there's significant reduction or deterioration in other aspects, what aspect are we talking about? One of the areas is economics. For example, African economics are not doing very well. Indeed, after we had, in the last decade, when we had some boom in terms of economic growth, which in itself did not translate, did not trickle down to all the citizenry on the continent, we have seen a stall in that particular growth rate. Why is that stall happening? It's all because African economies are tied into a global economic system where when you have growth in the metropolis, the satellites do not see growth. And that is what is happening. So those days when Africa was growing, it was because there was a dip in the economies of the metropolis, which is Europe and North America. And so we were able to export more natural resources, which we are dependent on very much. Now that we are not able to do that, now that prices of those natural resources have slammed down, what they use to measure GDP or growth rate is indicating that we are not doing well. In any case, GDP or GNP is not an adequate measure of a country's growth. That is another aspect of it. Now, when I say that Mo Ibrahim is paying lip service to the continent, for example, in terms of conflict, what is the root cause of all this conflict we are seeing in Africa? Perhaps apart from South Africa, we don't have arms manufacturing companies on the continent. But where are the numerous arms coming from? When we had the no-flight zone over Libya, and we had drones dropping huge armories in Libya, where did the arms go to after the Libyan war? And that's why I say that everybody should go back and look at the continent of Africa, the map of Africa. Just look at the fault line, the conflict fault line. See Libya, see where Chad is. See where Niger is. See where northern Nigeria is. See where Cameroon is. See where Central African Republic is. See where South Sudan and the Horn of Africa. And you see that they just run through like that. It tells you where the arms are going. The arms are being brought from somewhere. They should help us stop the infiltration of arms on the continent. Once that stops, part of the conflict will be solved. Aside that, in general, the Mo Ibrahim Governance Index is primarily based on two aspects of, the first aspect of participation and
participation in human rights
and human rights.
Law.
Yes. If you take participation, for example, is based on the Indian scholars Robert Dahl's notion of elections, which basically consists of participation and contestation. But the issue is that governance or participation just goes beyond national elections. Look at our local government system. Go to Zimbabwe, for example, and see. Go to Rwanda and see. There are more females in terms of in leadership position in what we call the district assembly level than perhaps at the national level. There are more females in terms of governance in countries like Rwanda and Zimbabwe than perhaps in Africa. In Ghana and Nigeria. Are you getting it? So you ask yourself, so if it comes to participation, is it only about participation in national elections? Okay. We were all in this country where somebody felt that his right has been trampled because he was disqualified from contesting a district assembly election. Over 10 billion of this country's precious resources was wasted because what? Because the Supreme Court ruled that the person had a case, and so the elections were stalled, and then we had to run it at a different time, which we incurred more cost. Is that not enhancing of rule of law? We are in this country where the lords, in whose bosom the law is, are now culpable of breaching the code of their practice. Are you getting it? And they are what? They are facing the same law which hitherto was in their bosom. Isn't it rule of law? We can count many instances, but you see, the actual thing is that you take Mali, for instance. We've seen turbulence in Mali. We saw people go on the street and say that we do not like this head of state, and the head of state must leave. In that circumstance, it creates chaos. Are you getting it? The ordinary person on the street of Mali is not concerned about what you think to be rule of law or whatever. That is not his primary concern. His primary concern is that within the sovereign state of Mali, where his sovereignty is at stake, he doesn't like somebody. However he would go about it, that is none of your business. All he wants is that that person must go. He wants another person whom he thinks will champion his interest. It doesn't lie in the hands of somebody else to use a particular universal principle or universal rule to come and judge whether that person is doing well or not. Okay. So I think as much as we would appreciate that there is a minimal level of measure that we can all work with, I think we must take cognizance of country-specific needs in some of these measurements. What actually is at the heart of the people? It can be that at a point in time, people are not really concerned about whether they have the right to vote or not to vote, but they are concerned about whether their daily livelihoods are secured. That is what they need. And once you are securing their daily livelihood for them, to them it is sufficient. Okay. When the people decide that they need more than that, then you can go ahead and open the space. And so look at the first 5 countries. And aside Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia that have fallen off the first 5. The constant 2 in that category has been Mauritius and Namibia. Mauritius and Namibia are not growing, are not following the kind of economic path that almost all the other 52 countries are following. Their development path has actually been one of a pro-poor approach. It has been a poverty reduction development path. And their political system is such that they have an amalgamation of all political parties ruling at a particular time, or at least the majority of parties. So at any point in time, you have a government that is based on a coalition of more than 4 or 5 strong political parties, which ensures what? Continuity, which ensures that there is a stable agenda in terms of poverty reduction. That is what is going on in a country like Botswana. The surprise country here, another surprise country is Mauritius, for example, where they had a form of inclusive governance, where you see citizens saying that, listen, this is what we want to do. This is what we want government to help us to do. And the government provides that services, and they also provide their end of the bargain, and things work. And you see that brought a significant transformation in the economy of Mauritius. So you see that these countries have not followed the kind of economic path that other countries are following, and they are doing it. As we speak now, can other countries veer off and follow that kind of economic path? The answer is no, because they're already entangled in a neo-colonial economic system which doesn't allow you the freedom to choose your own economic path. They are lucky because in Botswana, they really never were colonized by the British. The British only had passage through Botswana. But the state of Botswana, as we know it now, was still in the firm hands of traditional authorities. And these traditional authorities have been infused in the former governance system, and it is helping things. So I think that has worked for them. And so if they are in the first 5, I have no problem with it. But then it means that country-specific institutional settings and development path shapes or largely determines how they perform on the Mo Ibrahim index. And so going forward, I think that we should have a kind of index where credence is given to country-specific challenges, country-specific development issues, country-specific citizens' aspirations. And if we are able to have it that way, then the citizens will feel that, listen, we are being measured on a fair scale. They feel that their concerns are indeed what is being used to measure the progress of whatever democratic project we seem to be carrying out in our specific state. And that, I think, should be the way to go.
Okay, thank you for that. And so looking at Ghana specifically, Ghana's best performance among the 4 categories was in participation and human rights, for which it was ranked 2nd on the continent. In fact, it had 76.1%, well above the continental average of 49.3%. And its second performance was exhibited in human development. That's Ghana. Human development, it had 71.5% with a rank of 8, representing 1.1 increase since 2011. And then let's say the performance, okay, let's see the worst performance for Ghana. The lowest score was in the category of sustainable economic opportunity, and Ghana had 51.3% and was ranked 13th, reflecting the general downturn in that category, which in fact, okay, so basically looking at, Ghana has had some problems economically, and so that experienced the lowest continental average score of 43.2% percent. And so Ghana's economics was found wanting, especially in the following indicators: fiscal policy, access to financial records of state-owned companies, debt to exports ratio, and revenue to exports ratio. You understand all of these things better than I do. Economics, we were found wanting.
Well, I mean, sure, certainly. It's not just the Mo Ibrahim Index, by the way, that has pointed to this fact. I mean, all other indices of the measurement of economic growth and development for this year appear to suggest that at least the Ghanaian economy has suffered a lot. And in all cases, in all in the cases of all the other indices, you see some minimal gains that are made on the human capital development front. And it means you should go look at the indicators that feed into that particular component. Your basic education, for example. You have the kind of training programs that are provided at that level, okay, at the basic education level. If you look at our basic education, truth be told, comparatively, if you compare us to the other countries that you have across the continent, yeah, we might have done well because of the implementation of things like the capitation grant from 2011. I mean, lots of studies suggest that these things necessarily might have improved the level of enrollment, I should say, as an indicator that is used. That's another problem that I will agree with Otis, that the kind of quantitatives that sometimes we use end up biasing the kind of objectives or results that we're looking for. And so in terms of enrollment, yes, I've not seen indicators. If you look at, so you have a lot of people that are enrolled, that gives you a good score. That necessarily should translate into the kind of quality individuals that you have, even at the tertiary level, and how that transitions into the provision of the human capital that the country needs. Now, that transition is always lost, okay? And so if you take the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Index, for example, they provide a certain, the index creates 3 different strata for evaluation, okay? Indicators. You have basic infrastructure. So what kind of basics do we need as an economy? Then upon that, you have efficiency. Would you look at efficiency of the labor markets, whether or not the people that you, the foundation that you have created and the basic requirements necessarily empower you as an economy to utilize your resources efficiently. Then you move into places like sophistication and innovation. And we have always lost out on those 2 counts. And so Mo Ibrahim is right. On the other indicators of human capital development, if you look at the index that they use, the ingredients of the index, which would have been education, for basic education, for example, training and development that you might have at the tertiary level, comparatively would have been better, because you see where Ghana has performed. Look at the percentage, 76%. The whole sub-Saharan African average is quite low. And so we might make those gains because of the indicators that are used. But I can almost certainly tell you that if you pick other labor indicators, okay, if you take unemployment, we probably might not be doing as well as the index itself. And so that's good. That's okay. We have done good on that. But if you look at the general economy as a whole, I mean, they clearly make mention of the challenges that we've been confronted with. These are things that we have consistently discussed in this town. That right from 2011, when we posted that growth, we've been exposed to all kinds of vulnerabilities. Either they are coming from the external global economy, or we have challenges, particularly with our fiscal policy regime that we have practiced in this country. Monetary policy is equally dancing somewhere. And that has created the problem that a country finds today. And so I'm not surprised. I mean, it's not shocking. You've just gone to issue a Euro bond, you're being charged 10.75% for it. It's astronomical. In 2013, the finance minister said it's okay for people to issue bond at 12 and 15%. Now we are in 10.7. Okay? And so that speaks to the economic challenges that we've had. So we have created the human capital, that's fine. But to create economic opportunities by the use of the right tools that are at the disposal of government, i.e. fiscal policy, monetary policy, and broad macroeconomic policies, we haven't seen that level of commitment. Let's not leave it there. I mean, what would have caused that? I believe, and it's not just Africa. If you look at most of the other countries, majority of the countries you have in Africa today are commodity driven. Let's not play with that. Okay. Now, because we are not innovating enough, we are left at the commodity stage. What it means, therefore, is that your fiscal policy as government is always exposed to global economic vulnerabilities. When crude oil prices fall by 80%, 80% of government revenue is completely wiped off. What are the implications? Government spending on all these social interventions that we are talking about is equally curtailed. How do you engineer economic development? It becomes a challenge for you. More so when, besides this kind of challenges, you also have fiscal policy doing anything anyhow. We just invest in all kinds of programs for political gains and what have you. And sending different signals to the markets, not fixing the structural fundamental economic problems of creating jobs, employment, and the likes that we have discussed. Look at the energy crisis today. It's not just us. Tanzania, as we speak today, has shut down a 350 megawatt hydro plant. Why? Because water levels are low. And so these problems, you find them in bits and pieces across the continent, and that will necessarily be accounting for the challenges that we have today. Zimbabwe has got one of the highest literacy rates. I don't know how true that is, but I keep seeing numbers in the excess of 90 percentages, okay? But unemployment in that country is crazy, it's very high. And so you find the same problem like we have here. You might create the base for human capital development, but there must be a certain end goal, which Mo Ibrahim defines as providing economic, political, and social opportunities. It's a job that you, the state, need to do. When I say the state should do, I don't mean the state should go and put up a company and employ people. I'm saying the state needs to create the ambience so that that guy who's running the cold store and has employed a young man who has just finished secondary school won't lay him off because he doesn't have power. The ambience has got to be created so people can do business and survive.
Interesting.
You see,
we're wrapping up.
When you talk about the ambience, that come again, when you are not in charge of your own destiny, how do you create the opportunity to achieve your destiny?
You see,
the economies that we are running,
Yes.
the economies that we are running in Africa are controlled by external forces. As you rightly said,
I disagree.
Crude oil. No, but you made allusions to that.
No,
we are resource-driven economy.
No, you are resource driven. Nobody prevents you. No, for example, when I just made a comparison with the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Index. Okay, nobody compels you not to innovate. From businesses through individuals to government, nobody was investing in R&D, and our scores on R&D plummeted.
And R&D is
that's
research and development. If you don't do that,
that is not. You see, I will not create an excuse for the African state. The state in Africa is equally as guilty as the external forces that are controlling our
50
economy.
years, 50 years you've been in charge of your you've had to dictate your policy.
We are here when the structural adjustment starts in Africa. And don't forget, you are still in the structural adjustment period. Only that we've had it in different phases. Started with structural adjustment, came with PAMS card, came with globalization. Now it is good governance. This is still structural adjustment in different phases that we are continuing. What I'm trying to say is that I will not give brief to the African states, to the government, the various governments on the continent. They are equally as guilty as the external forces. But this is the issue. We are a resource-driven economy. The R&D that we are talking about, it was the same people who are accusing African government of not investing in R&D who said that cut funding to tertiary education and that all you needed to be able to live was to give funding to basic education. And that's how come that in the 80s and up to the 90s, a lot of African government reduced funding to a lot of their state universities, which significantly reduced the amount of research and development that was going on in those institutions. And then you see that there was a mass spread of basic education facilities in a lot of African countries. It was a Western-driven political and economic agenda. Now,
but is that good?
No, it's not good. And what I'm saying is that the African state was complicit in this because they also accepted it and implemented it hook, line, and sinker. We have people like Kwesi Botwe who were at the forefront of implementing structural adjustment, came with farms card. When they resigned, where did they go? They went back to the World Bank. It is the same ideas that they were following.
But going forward, in all of that, Kagame has come out clear. Kagame is in bed with virtually all these issues you're talking about. Kenya, okay, has equally cut funding over the years to tertiary education. Kenya, innovatively, is leading on the continent. And so, yes, I can understand that.
Kenya is innovatively leading on the continent in terms of what?
Technology, we can't compare. Technology in terms of financial services,
M-Pesa.
agriculture.
M-Pesa.
Oh, M-Pesa is just...
M-Pesa is
Kenya
not
has a whole Kenya has a whole community.
As much as
It has a whole
widely
community, okay, that is for innovative people who are building innovative technology that supports agriculture, water, health,
well, of course, they are doing
all of that. Kagame's Rwanda today, we are told, is a cleaner city. I mean, they are building drone ports. Look, let's get serious. Those of us in West Africa, have a problem.
Yes,
West African countries
those of us in
have
West
a
Africa
problem.
talk too much and do little.
We do little.
Okay.
We do little.
Kagame's
let's
Rwanda
wrap
is
up
doing
now.
well. Why is Kagame's Rwanda doing well? Why is Kagame in bed with all these institutions and still doing well? It's because that, you see, when you don't understand the politics that play behind some of these things, we will just make some of these sweeping statements. But the issue is that as much as Kagame is what an iron fist ruler, he has changed the constitution and is running for another 5-year term. Who is talking about it? If it had happened in Cote d'Ivoire, what would have happened? Perhaps France would have come back again to overthrow the sovereign head of state. But what I'm saying is that when you look at the case of Ghana, for instance, and we are saying that human development, we've done well.
Okay.
For you to be able to do well in human development is for you to spend a chunk of your resources on what we call social interventionist programs. And that is what Ghana, for example, has done in a very long time. Now, what we've not been able to do, for example, is to able to match our productivity with the kind of investment that we are putting into these services. And that, I think, is a huge challenge that the state should look at. And when I say the state, I'm not only talking about the elected politicians, but I'm talking about all those who are in position of authority, being in the civil, public service, or even in the private businesses. There's the need for us to have the sense of agency in trying to use our own resources to develop our country, and by extension, the whole of Africa.
Okay.
Now, Mo Ibrahim Index is okay. It might not be good, in my own opinion.
Okay.
But then I think that it is time for us as a continent, as a people, to realize that we need to have our destiny in our hands.
Okay.
We don't need anyone to dictate how we should go about it. But we need to sit down and reflect and ask ourselves whether the progress we've made so far, is it okay? Are we satisfied by it? If we are not satisfied, how do we want to go ahead? And then once we are able to answer these basic questions and come up with the steps that we think that we can pursue in achieving our destiny or our collective goals, then we can go ahead in doing that.
Okay.
But this piecemeal approach will not help.
Okay.
It is important for us to understand that there is a battle line in global politics. There's a battle line in global economics. And if you don't understand that battle line, if you don't understand the forces behind the battle line, and you don't prepare yourself adequately to take your destiny into your own hands and approach that battle with the fierceness that it deserves, there's nothing that will go your way. And that's what I think Africa in general has lacked. Leadership is key in this area. We need a purposeful leadership. And when I'm talking about leadership yet again, I'm not talking about the elected politician, but I'm talking about the directors of state-owned enterprises. I'm talking about the business moguls. I'm talking about the managing directors of the several private-owned companies that we have. I'm talking about the elected bureaucrats, politicians who sit in the legislature, who are given some form of political authority to be able to negotiate favorable terms on our behalf. I'm talking about this three set of people. Even religious leaders are part of the leadership in this country. We need a purposeful leadership.
What makes them purposeful?
What made them purposeful is a leadership that's first and foremost are preaching the basic things that would take the society forward.
Just preaching?
When I say preaching, I'm not saying just preaching it out to their people, but also seen to be doing it and carrying their people along with them. And we don't need only the politicians to do that. We need the civil servants to do that. We need the chief directors to do that. We need a whole lot of government, public sector employees to do that. We need the private sector to be doing that. Because you have this private sector who are saying that because you're in a liberalized economy, they can just pay their way through, go outside there, bring any cheap products, and then dump it into the economy. It is a collusion of a business person and somebody in government who will bring this thing, who will dump toxic or substandard goods on the content. But when you have a purposeful leadership, and they both agree that dumping in cheap products in this country is not the best way, but we need to create our own products, our own standard, our own measure of quality, and export it outside. Then we've started we are on the right path towards an inclusive and purposeful development. And that is what I think that we should be looking at as a country and a continent as a whole.
Great. So final word in just 1 minute.
Final words. I want to put this debate in a certain context, which is that Mo Ibrahim makes you understand that at least the index was created in 2007. So he's been tracking what has been happening across the continent since 2007. But he does a comparison over the past 15 years, 15, 20 years. And he's right when he does that, because, I mean, a lot of the countries were still experiencing all kinds of instability. And gradually, I mean, you don't see the number of coups you saw in the 90s anymore on the continent. So naturally, you see that there's been some level of progression. His concern, though, is that since 2011, something appears to be stalling. He's not saying it is stalled, it is stalling. And so you see, the gains that you were making as a continent, I mean, individual countries, which invariably feeds into what the continent is doing, the gains are beginning to slow down. And so begin looking at what the causal factors are and interrogate those causal factors and see if you can do something spectacular. I agree with Kafui when he says that we would have to understand the kind of leadership that we have and all of that stuff. All of that is good. But I can almost certainly tell you that the kind of economies and countries run in Africa, your behavior as a businessman, my behavior as a business person, his behavior as an individual is extremely influenced and determined by the construct of policy. Let's put that on record. So that today, Ghana, for instance, has an economy that is in serious challenges. If you're a business person, you are supposed to necessarily navigate your way through things you wouldn't have planned for. You have to be planning for them. And so when we say leadership, I first of all want to place the call within the context of what we're discussing today. That's the index. I'll place a call on the quarters of the political elite. That's one. Two, what is the structure of governance that we have? What's the social contract? Contract between the governed and the governments that we have in Africa. Okay, everybody should have a concern on what is happening, for example, in Rwanda. I mean, the fact that we are delivering the public goods, as it were, like the index would describe, does not necessarily mean it's participatory. Go to Shanghai, right? Per capita GDP is in excess of $30,000. What did we see in Shanghai? People wanted to participate, started calling for an uproar. Okay, and so it is important. We don't have to get to the state of Shanghai to be able to understand the consequences of some of these decisions that we make on the continent. More so, when a lot of these countries, you find spots of conflict and spots of instability. That is happening fundamentally for all kinds of reasons. Okay, we can drag colonialists into it. We can drag the vested interest of the current leaders that you have in there. But at least the index tells us a certain direction that the continent, in terms of its governance, is shifting towards. And I think all the countries that have been mentioned to be below, every country that has been mentioned to have slipped over the past 4 years, I think is rightly so. Ghana has slipped. We can't play with it. For the past 4 to 5 years, the fiscal outlook has not been good. We all know it. And the index points to that. And so we should put the debate in that context and learn from the results of the index. And that is the way we go forward. Because if we don't measure our output and put indicators on them, we have challenges. We can't develop indices for or context for all 54 countries. It's just not possible to do that. There should be a metric for comparison.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not sure, but the index points to the fact that the area in which Ghana scored lowest was in terms of economic opportunities.
But the highest was participation and human rights.
Human rights, yeah. But even in that, in economic opportunity, it says that access to official government finance reports and all those things. I'm not too sure the context in which the governance index looked at to assess those documents. But I'm very well informed that if you look at Auditor General's report, for example, it's a public document, and any citizens or a citizen of average interest in what is happening in the state can have access to those things. So I'm not too sure what particular documents.
All the SOEs, I use lots of those documents. All SOEs don't have their documents published. Even the Auditor General struggles to get access to documents when they're going to audit. He has a constitution backing. PIAC, who is even supposed to monitor petroleum revenue, PIAC struggles to get access to these documents. So when you go to our district levels, the common district assemblies, when they appear GTV government, we know they appear. They come and answer questions. They don't have documents. The Public Accounts Committee is always on them.
Interesting, thank you.
I am very happy that we have said this. So it comes back to the district assembly official is not an elected person. And if you know how the district assembly concept works,
he's appointed by an electorate.
No.
So he's appointed by somebody who's elected.
Yes. So you see, we should make sure that institutions work. So all this basically comes back to the point of institutions.
Governance is one.
Governance is one. The institutions are those rules that human beings must enforce.
Interesting.
But governance is one of the institutions. And more is telling you that if you put all of these things together, you're slowing down.
Change your heart and change your mind. Let us all do that, and things will work for us.
Thank you for ending on that note. And so we've been talking about the Mo Ibrahim Index of African Governance, especially looking at the 2015 report, which said that Africa is showing some progress, but growth is stalling, and so there should be much more pace with regard to some of these indicators that we've mentioned: safety and rule of law, participation in human rights, sustainable economic opportunity, and human development. My guests who have helped me delve into this report: Kafui Otis Chepo, he's with the African Leadership Center, and then Patrick Stevenson is a policy analyst, and so they have helped to do justice to the issue. I'm Conrad Kakraba. We'll be back again same time next week with another issue on the continent of Africa that ties in to the global perspective. This has been Worldview, where we tell you the African story in the context of world affairs. Thank you so much for your time. Bye for now.
Discussion about Africa to be based on facts, on data, not on emotions.